On your knees, prisoner! The guards hurled Celine Kalin into the mud. Fists hammered her ribs, boots crushed her shoulders, chains cut deep into her skin. For 3 long days they mocked her, starved her, beat her, believing she would finally break. But when the shift change came, her eyes burned with fire. She lunged, shattering a guard's jaw with the chain around her wrists, then drove his rifle into another's chest, the yard erupting in screams as steel flashed and the camp walls shook with chaos. Minutes later, dust and thunder filled the air as Celine seized the controls of an enemy hind, turning their war machine against them. They thought she was finished. They were wrong. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week, like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The sky was a hard white heat when the missile found them, a single strobe of warning, a shudder that tore through the airframe, then a roar that swallowed the cockpit. Celine Kalin's hands moved before thought, collective eased, pedals countered, cyclic steady, training lashing reflex and muscle into one braided cord. The Apache shivered, yawed, bled altitude in ragged gulps. A thicket opened like a last-second door across the Bakhtara Plateau, a scar of scrub and rock where a machine might limp to ground if a pilot refused to let go. She refused. Metal shrieked. The main rotor scythed at saplings, biting, coughing, catching air again. Warning tones clawed at her ears. Celine glanced right. Aaron Creed's visor was spidered with cracks, blood pooling at the edge of his mask. His fingertips searched for switches that weren't there anymore. She talked to him the way you talk to a friend in a burning room, calm, clipped, ruthless with terror. Stay with me. Keep your head down. I've got it. The earth surged up. She set the wounded bird down the only way left, a controlled fall disguised as a landing. Silence is loud after fire. For 3 heartbeats, only the ticking of hot metal and the far uncertain bark of small arms. Celine shoved against the restraints, popped canopy, tasted dust and fuel. Creed was breathing shallow. A ragged little saw, she cut him free and dragged him into the sliver of shade under the ruined fuselage. Her hands, slick with someone else's life, pressed against his chest where red kept seeping like a secret. She wanted a medic. She wanted another 5 minutes of sky to carry him to one. Wanting had never altered reality. His gloved hand found hers, squeezed once, and slackened. Grief has no room to sprawl in combat. It's forced to stand in the corner and watch. Celine wiped her face with the back of her wrist and listened. Voices were coming, too many, too close, boots beating a rhythm she'd rather not dance to. The survival kit was mostly intact, her sidearm somewhere under twisted panels, her flares a memory. She could run. The brush might hide her for a moment. The plateau, though, was a bowl, and she could feel eyes on the rim already. She did the math you only do once, live to fight by choosing when the fight begins. They took her hard, rough hands, a shove that bounced her cheek off dirt, the coarse taste of grit. A hood went over her head. The world shrank to canvas, heat, and the smell of unwashed cloth. Every time her knees hesitated, a rifle butt offered encouragement. A voice behind her, young and proud of its cruelty, told the others she was just a pilot. "Pilots," he said, "talk fast when you unplug their courage." She didn't answer. In the darkness of the hood, she recited the bones of who she was. Name, rank, number. She pictured a horizon line. She built a map out of sound. The chop of rotors somewhere to the east, power generators. To the south, a truck with a sick clutch barking each time it downshifted. Her mind made a grid she could walk later with her eyes open. The hood came off at the gate, Razor wire spidered the top of high fence. The towers wore machine guns like spines. Bunkers squatted in the corners, low, ugly, efficient. The sun threw long spears across the yard. Celine's vision pulsed at the edges. She blinked and kept her head level. They put her on her knees for someone to look at, an officer with a well-pressed uniform, and the kind of calm that comes from being certain the world belongs to you. He was not their commander. She could smell middle management on him, the sour tang of a man happy to inflict but not to decide. He peered at her flight suit scraps, the patches, the burned edges, then nodded to the guards as if to say she would bruise like anyone else. They paraded her through the camp the way a hunter shows off a head before it's mounted. Prisoners glanced up from shadows, thin faces, tight mouths that would not beg. In the far corner, a figure with a shaved scalp and a ragged sleeve watched her with the focused stillness of a stalking cat. She filed that glance away without a name. Labels could wait. What mattered was the layout, barracks aligned in cruel order, a gash of dirt road cutting, to a concrete pad, beyond it, a metal disc gleaming with leaks and scuffs. Fuel. Not far from that, an open box of tarmac with paint scuffed into a broken H. Oil stains bloomed dark as old wounds. A landing zone. The breeze carried kerosene and hot metal. Helicopters came here often. She would need more than that fact. But facts have a way of gathering once you find the first one. They put her in a cage that had seen a lot of stories end. A bucket. A chain through a ring in the floor, the steel rubbing her ankles raw with each small human movement. Shift, breathe, swallow. Someone shoved a tin of water at her and a pan that had forgotten the taste of soap. Across the aisle, in another pen, a man with a stitched eyebrow murmured, a psalm under his breath, the words falling like stones into a river. Her mouth was too dry to pray. She watched instead, counting footsteps between towers, listening for whistles and the pattern underneath them. A camp is a machine. If you know where the cogs sit, you can jam them with the simplest small thing. The first knock and drag was short. A room that thought itself clean. A table that hoped to be intimidating. A bare bulb that grew heat like a grudge. The man waiting inside had a face like a cliff, narrow and wind-carved, and eyes that might have been blue once before they learned to be ice. Not the middle manager from the yard. This one did not wear insecurity. He flipped through a file with her name written wrong on the tab and asked questions with the patience of a fisherman. Base, unit, codes, patrol routes. She gave him the only 3 truths she was allowed. He smiled the way winter smiles when someone says they're not cold. The first strike wasn't the worst. It's the hope you bleed on the floor that aches later. They didn't break her in that room. Interrogations are long games. They returned her to the pen to let time soften edges. Time did not cooperate. She sat with her back to the bars, knees up, chin on her wrists, eyes half closed. Every movement of the camp was a bead on a string she was threading when the tower crews were swapped, when the trucks with dog cages returned, when the siren tested its voice. Twice, shadows passed overhead, helicopter shapes smeared by heat, one heavy and predatory, one smaller and brisk. The heavy one carried a throb you felt in your bones, a low animal growl that vibrated through fence posts. A hind, her mind said, measuring blade frequency without instruments, noting how the descent angle flattened. Before touchdown, how long the turbines spooled down before the scream of fuel pumps cut in. She turned her head and coughed so a guard wouldn't see the calculation on her face. By the second afternoon, she had catalogued more than sounds. The guard who liked to hum carried his keys loose on a split ring that caught the sun at the same point each circuit. The officer with the clipboard never looked left when he passed the barracks door. He assumed a wall was always a wall. The fuel hose was patched in 2 places, wrapped with tape bubbling from heat. Someone had carelessly left a wheel chock near the edge of the pad, painted safety yellow and forgotten like most safety things. The chain on her ankle had 2 links that were ever so slightly stretched, as if someone bigger had once worried them like a toothache. She marked them with touches of thumb and forefinger until the skin there burned. Guilt came at dusk when the light makes everything honest. Creed's laughter lived in her ears. So did the dull, final exhale his chest had given up beneath her palms. She let the memory do what it came to do, hurt her, remind her there was a debt that couldn't be paid in tears. Then she told the grief to sit down and be quiet. She had work to map. She counted her breaths in groups, used them to build a rhythm she could climb like a ladder. This is what survival training had always been about, not the tricks, but the stubbornness to keep at the problem until the problem yielded. Late on the 3rd day, they hauled her out again to break her in front of a different audience. The yard was busier, trucks idled near the gate. A crate of mortar rounds sat open under a tarp the color of faded moss. Heat bleached the edges of sounds until even shouting sounded far away. They shoved her forward, and she stumbled, catching herself with chained hands and refusing to kiss dirt. The same junior officer who had catalogued her bruises on arrival strutted up with a grin that wanted to be a sneer. He asked if she was ready to be sensible. She gave him her identification as if it were a blessing. He laughed for the benefit of the men on the fence and turned to walk away. Something in her face must have irritated him. He came back and leaned down until she could smell the coffee on his breath. "You're not special," he said softly. "The way men say vile things when they want to wear intimacy like armor. You're just another bundle we'll unwrap." She tilted her head and let her gaze slide past him to the open slice of sky over the pad, blue and ruthless. A rotary shadow crossed, not close, but close enough that the guard on Tower 3 shaded his eyes. The officer noticed her look and misread it. He chuckled and patted her cheek with 2 fingers. "The way you would a dog you think you've trained." "That sound," he said, as the far turbine spooled. "That's what hunts men who run. Hunt me," she thought, and keep thinking it. The worst mistakes are the ones made with confidence. They dragged her back toward the pens, but took the long way, and long ways are generous to eyes that need angles. She memorized the slope of the gravel beside the fuel shed, the gap under the chain link next to the generator hut where a storm had eaten dirt away, the knot of weeds that had punched through a crack in the concrete near the landing markings. None of it was a plan yet. Plans required people, timing, a moment when the machine of the camp clicked into a predictable groove, but she could feel the teeth of the gear, and it thrilled her in a quiet, holy way. When they shoved her down at the threshold of her cage, a guard reached to lift her by the shoulder. The gesture was almost courteous, a performance for the men watching. She shrugged him off and stood under her own power. Pride is a small ration, but it burns hot. She met the eyes on the fence without blinking. In that silence, where ridicule was a thin scab over fear, she let her voice find the steady timbre she used in the cockpit when crews on the ground needed certainty. "You misjudged what you caught," she said. "Not loud, not for the crowd, but for the world itself. You didn't net a broken bird. You put bars around a storm. Someone jeered, someone else didn't. Not all men in uniform have forgotten how to listen to weather." That night, no, not night, she refused to give the camp the romance of darkness toward. Late day as Orange skated across metal and glass, the rotor beat returned, the heavy one. It trimmed power and settled somewhere beyond the fuel shed. A truck backfired, voices hurried, she counted. On the 30th beat, the tower crews swapped. On the 35th, the outer gate clicked and stilled. The chain around her ankle had warmed to her skin. She twisted her foot and felt the two stretched links grind faintly around the ring, a minor movement, a test, no attention. She relaxed and rolled her shoulders as if uncomfortable, letting the action become a habit no guard could tell from fatigue. Celine rested her head against the bar and closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to see better. She traced the yard in her mind where the shadows would fall when the sun slid lower tomorrow, where the generators coughed when the pumps primed, where the men cursed because the hose kinked. She heard Creed in memory, teasing, calling her Viper the way only friends could make a title sound like home. She let the ache in and then out again, like breath. She was not finished. She would not be finished until men who thought themselves hunters learned how it felt to be prey to the tool they worshipped. When the guard passed with his keys, she matched her breathing to his footsteps, learning the rhythm so deeply she could anticipate the pause before he scratched at his ear, the small hitch when he stepped around the gouge in the floor. Patterns were gifts. Tomorrow, she told herself, or the day after, the camp would open its throat in the same place it swallowed pride. She would be ready. She would make the first cut quick and clean, then the second deeper. On the far side of the aisle, the man with the stitched eyebrow stopped his murmur long enough to whisper across the dim, "Pilot?" It wasn't a question anyone needed answered, but sometimes naming a thing gives it weight. She didn't turn. "Keep your voice," she said softly. "You'll need it." He breathed out a sound that might have been agreement. The plateau exhaled heat, the way a forge breathes when the bellows rest. Celine flexed her fingers, the skin at her wrists raw where metal had kissed too long. She pictured a cockpit she'd never flown, a panel where switches lived under different names but obeyed the same laws, a machine that would arch up and away at her command. She could feel the heft of a foreign collective in her grip already, the stubborn give of unfamiliar hydraulics, the tilt she'd need to bank low across her own shadow. She let the image settle like a promise. "They think you're done," she told herself, not unkindly. Let them swallow that story until it chokes. Somewhere outside the wire, a dog barked and barked, and then forgot what it was barking at. The heavy rotors sighed down in the distance. The camp returned to its own shallow heartbeat. She closed her eyes and threaded another bead onto her string of facts. Tomorrow would ask for blood and nerve. Tomorrow would ask for more than that. She would give it. Not because she was brave, bravery is what you name a decision afterward, but because there was no other choice that honored the man whose hand had gone slack in hers, and the men whose eyes had followed her through the fence with that quiet, sharp attention. She owed them more than survival. She owed them a world where the sound of a helicopter meant rescue again. She leaned her forehead against cool steel and allowed herself one small smile that no one could see. The camp had a rhythm. So did she. If they wanted her to be a prisoner, she would be the kind a cage remembers. The second dawn in captivity broke pale and sharp, the plateau air thin, and cold enough to sting her lungs when they dragged her from the cage. The compound smelled of boiled grain and diesel, a mix that clung to the back of the throat. Celine stumbled once on gravel, not from weakness but because the man shoving her kept changing pace to remind her who held the chain. At the interrogation block, the world shrank to concrete walls, a chair bolted into the floor, and a bulb that glared like judgment. This time the officer waiting was different, taller, composed, the set of his jaw suggesting command rather than cruelty for show. Viktor Dragunov, the camp's master, stepped into her vision with the calm of someone who had outweighted countless prisoners. His eyes did not roam her bruises, they studied her silence, the way you might regard a puzzle you expect to solve. He spoke evenly, almost courteous. He told her she was no longer in the sky but in his house, and that here obedience was inevitable. He gestured to the guards, and they obliged with fists and boots when she declined to respond. Through the haze of impact, Celine caught his faint smile, the kind that comes when a chess player thinks he has cornered his opponent. She breathed slowly, answered only with her name, her rank, and her number. The rest she kept locked behind clenched teeth, letting him stew in his own confidence. Dragunov leaned close enough for her to feel his breath. Every pilot breaks. You'll beg to share what you know. You'll trade secrets for water, for sleep, for less pain. He let the words settle before signaling for her return to the pen. As the guards hauled her away, she fixed his expression in her memory, not as a source of fear, but as a reminder of what she would dismantle. Back among the cages, whispers trickled through the bars. A hand brushed hers briefly, a risk in itself. The voice was low, deliberate. "You flew Apaches." It came from a wiry man with a scar splitting his brow, eyes steady despite weeks in confinement. He introduced himself in a hushed breath as Sergeant Darius Holt, captured 3 weeks earlier with his reconnaissance team. His presence radiated quiet authority, the kind that made other prisoners glance his way for cues. Celine gave no direct answer, only the smallest nod. Holt leaned against his bars as if weary, but his voice was tight with calculation. "We're planning something soon." Guard shift change. East perimeter's weak. He sketched the barest outline. Overwhelm 2 watchmen, break for the forest, rely on cover and endurance to carry them out. She listened, gaze unfocused, as if half asleep. Inside, her mind stripped the plan bare. She had heard the helicopters each evening, felt their shadows cut across the yard. She knew the dogs bayed louder at nightfall when handlers circled the wire. Forest cover was no ally against heat-seeking optics and armed gunships. Holt's escape would buy them hours at best before searchlights and rotor thunder cornered them in gullies. When the guards drifted out of earshot, she turned her head just enough to catch his attention. "On foot you won't get far. They'll find you before sunrise." A voice was husky from thirst but firm. His eyes narrowed, wary of hope that sounded like dissent. "You have a better idea?" Celine let silence linger, then tilted her chin toward the fuel pad in the distance. A hind settled there every evening, its turbines howling like a beast before cooling into silence. "I've been listening, watching. They're careless. One machine lands here daily, full of power, barely guarded. You want to live? Don't run from it. Take it." Holt studied her, as if weighing madness against possibility. His jaw flexed. "That's not the kind of thing we do without certainty." She met his skepticism with steel. "It's the only certainty you'll get. Running through trees is suicide. Flying out is war on our terms." For a moment, disbelief and calculation wrestled across his face. She recognized the conflict, the soldier's instinct to hold to doctrine against the lure of an impossible gamble. He gave no answer then, only retreated into his pen, but his silence was less dismissive than before. The day dragged on. Guards shifted lazily, unaware of eyes recording every step. Celine traced the routes of supply carts, the rhythm of tower replacements, the way the radio crackled seconds before patrols returned. She stored each fragment, weaving them into a map of vulnerabilities. Pain radiated through her ribs with each breath, but she carried it like ballast, a reminder. That survival demanded more than endurance. It demanded imagination sharper than the enemy's. By dusk, when the yard glowed amber and shadows stretched long, Dragunov appeared once more. He walked the perimeter slowly, flanked by escorts, surveying his domain. His gaze lingered on Celine's cage. "You should consider Holt's path," he said in accented English, voice pitched to carry. "The forest offers a quick end, better than what waits in here." Celine raised her eyes, unflinching. "You mistake me for prey," she answered quietly, though loud enough for Holt to hear. "You'll find I bite." A flicker passed across Dragonoff's face, gone in an instant, replaced by that same infuriating calm. He left without reply, but Holt's attention burned on her afterward, sharp with new respect. Later, as darkness crawled over the plateau, Holt leaned close again, voice nearly swallowed by the hum of generators. "If we do this your way, it won't be just slipping a few guards. It'll be fire, noise, blood." Celine's answer was steady. "Better to fight in the sky than be hunted on the ground. You've men ready to risk everything. Give them a chance at more than a grave in these woods." Silence held between them, heavy with the weight of decision. At last Holt exhaled, slow and resigned. "We'll need timing, we'll need weapons, and we'll need to believe you can fly what isn't ours." Celine let her eyes drift toward the pad again, where the scent of kerosene clung to the evening air. Metal is metal. Lift, drag, thrust, they obey the same laws. All I need is the cockpit. The rest is just hands and will. Holt said nothing, but when he lay back against the bars, the line of his shoulders was no longer despair. The others in nearby cages watched the exchange in silence, and though no words passed, something electric rippled through the prisoners. The sense that captivity had shifted, that within their ranks stood someone who refused to think inside fences. That night, Celine closed her eyes not to rest but to plan. Dragonoff believed he had time, that pressure and hunger would grind her down. He had no idea that each hour added strength to her map, that every routine. His men repeated, sharpened the knife she was forging in her mind. Tomorrow, or the day after, the storm would break from inside the cage. And when it did, she would not simply escape, she would rise. The plateau held its breath the next morning, the compound waking with the brittle, quiet of soldiers who believed nothing unexpected would dare enter their routines. Celine Kalen sat slouched against the cold iron of her cage, eyelids heavy as though she had surrendered to fatigue. In truth, her mind was a taut wire, every sense tuned to the rhythm of boots, the shuffle of weapons being checked, the barking of orders at the far gate. She had learned the camp's heartbeat, and today she intended to interrupt it. Across the aisle, Sergeant Darius Holt leaned forward on his knees, murmuring low so the guards heard only a man muttering prayers. "You're certain about this?" His tone was a mix of doubt and grudging curiosity. Celine's gaze never shifted from the dirt floor, but her voice cut steady, certain enough that running into the trees is a coffin with a lid already waiting. "This is the only way we make it out." He didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, broken only by the clink of keys as a guard ambled by. When the man disappeared down the row, Holt pressed closer to the bars. "I've got 12 men still fit to fight. Not all strong, but willing. They've been looking to me for a plan. If I hand them over to you, and this fails..." His sentence trailed off, heavy with consequence. Celine finally turned her eyes to his. "Then we die here, instead of dying in the forest. At least this way we die with a chance to fly." Something shifted in his expression, an ember catching, reluctant but undeniable. He gave a short nod, then leaned back as if the matter were closed. But Celine knew he was not convinced so much as cornered by logic sharper than hope. The day dragged, the heat baking the dust into a hard crust beneath their cages. Celine let her body sag, conserving strength. Beneath that mask of weariness, she traced her thumb over the stretched link of chain again, feeling the faint give. Tonight would test whether stubborn iron or stubborn will held stronger. By late afternoon, when the sun dipped and shadows grew long, the chance came. Guards swapped shifts near the outer wall, 2 men lingering too long in conversation. Another barked at them from the tower. The brief distraction was enough. Celine rose in a fluid motion, bringing her bound wrists up with sudden force. The chain looped across the jaw of the nearest guard through the bars, the crack of bones startling as a rifle clattered from his grasp. Before the others could react, she shoved the weapon under the bars, kicking it toward Holt's reach. He snatched it up without hesitation. Shouts erupted, boots thundered. Celine dragged the stunned guard against the cage, yanking his keyring free with her shackled hands. Pain tore at her wrists, but the lock yielded with a click that sang like freedom. She burst out, driving her shoulder into the chest of another soldier rushing forward. He toppled backwards, wind crushed from his lungs, and Holt was on him an instant later, rifle butt smashing into temple. Chaos split the compound wide open. Prisoners shouted, some banging against their own bars, others seizing any loose object as a weapon. Guards scrambled, torn between containing the riot and protecting themselves. Celine swung the chain around her hand like a whip, striking a third man across the temple. Blood sprayed, the man crumpling into the dust. For a moment time slowed, the clang of alarms, the confusion on Dragunov. Soldiers' faces as they realized the fight was no longer theirs alone. Holt's voice roared above the din. "Move! Get them out!" His men surged to action, breaking cages, pulling fellow captives to their feet. The compound became a storm of bodies, desperation lending strength where hunger had stolen it. Celine bent, snatching a dropped pistol, the weight familiar and reassuring. She glanced once toward the concrete pad beyond the fence. Already she could hear it, the distant thrum of rotors, the sound that had haunted her nights. A hind was inbound, summoned by alarm before anyone inside realized they had lost control of their own prison. She met Holt's eyes. "This is our moment. We take the pad." He swallowed, then shouted for his men to follow. Together, they surged toward the breach. Celine led the charge, her chain now discarded, pistol blazing as she fired at floodlights and watchtowers to blind their overseers. Holt covered her flank, barking orders, steadying men who stumbled. Dragunov himself appeared on the balcony of the command post, his face a mask of disbelief cracking into rage. He shouted commands in his native tongue, gesturing wildly toward the landing zone. Celine caught his glare across the yard, a cold acknowledgement passing between captor and captive. The gates were forced open with sheer desperation. A truck parked near the fuel shed became a shield as Celine dove behind it, bullets striking sparks from its metal side. She leaned out, returning fire with precision, keeping pressure on the guards still scrambling to organize. Then the air trembled. The MiL-24 Hind dropped low, blades beating dust into choking clouds as it approached for its scheduled refuel. Its silhouette loomed monstrous against the twilight, a predator descending without a clue it was flying into a trap. Celine's pulse steadied. This was the pivot. Everything she had endured, every bruise, every insult, it converged here. "Get ready," she called, her voice low but carrying. "We're not running, we're taking our wings." Holt looked at her as though still struggling to believe, but the sight of men rallying behind her, eyes bright with sudden conviction, sealed his decision. He slammed a new magazine into his weapon and gave a grim nod. The prison yard shook with alarms, but amidst the uproar, Celine's plan had taken root. For the first time since the crash, she felt the air belonged to her again. This was no longer about surviving. It was about turning the enemy's greatest asset into their undoing. And as the hind's wheels touched dust, Selene surged forward, a storm unchained, ready to carve freedom out of the sky. Dust boiled across the yard as the hind lowered, its engines howling like an animal announcing its arrival. Selene crouched behind the wrecked fuel truck, eyes narrowing against the grit in the air. Around her, Holt's men steadied themselves, some clutching scavenged. Rifles, others gripping makeshift blades torn from broken crates. Fear and anticipation mingled in their faces, but they followed her lead, waiting for her signal. Selene glanced at Holt. His jaw was locked tight, but there was no hesitation now. He had committed. Together, they had a slim window, seconds when the aircrew believed they were. Among allies, when the blades were still spinning but discipline was loose. That was the opening she had predicted, the one chance to strike before the prison guard force. Realized the chaos was not fleeing captives, but an uprising bearing down on their lifeline. She whispered, "We can't damage the cockpit. Weapons free on anyone outside." Holt relayed the command, his voice carrying the authority of experience. The prisoners shifted into position, forming a crescent around the landing zone. The hind's skids struck earth with a thud, the rotor wash flattening weeds and stinging exposed skin. Two crewmen leapt out, one stretching, the other fumbling for the fuel hose. They didn't notice the shadows tightening around them, until Selene rose from cover, pistol raised. "Now!" she barked. Gunfire cracked, not wild but measured. Holt dropped the refueling soldier with a shot to the thigh, while another, captive, tackled the second man, wrenching him into the dust. Guards from the tower tried to pivot their weapons, but Selene had already fired. At the spotlight, plunging the pad into a haze of half-light and smoke, screams cut across the confusion as more prisoners surged from hiding, overwhelming the scattered defenders. Selene sprinted toward the hind, ducking beneath the swirling blades, the downwash hammering her shoulders. Her hand grazed the fuselage, warm metal alive with vibration. She climbed fast, forcing open the cabin door. The pilot inside spun, eyes wide, reaching for his sidearm. She slammed her forearm into his wrist, knocking the weapon away, then drove her knee into his chest harness. The breath fled his lungs in a strangled gasp. Behind her, Holt's men dragged the CO pilot from his seat, binding him with straps ripped from their own restraints. The rest of the aircrew were pinned to the ground by prisoners too desperate to let go. Selene slid into the pilot's chair, fingers brushing unfamiliar switches. The layout was foreign, Russian script glaring back at her, but the fundamentals spoke a language she knew by heart. Collective, cyclic pedals, principles that didn't care which flag painted the tail. She breathed once, steady, then began the sequence she'd rehearsed 100 times in her mind, trusting instinct and training to bridge the gaps. Outside, Holt leaned into the doorway, shouting over the engine noise. "How long until we can move?" "Minutes if everything runs clean," Selene shot back, eyes flicking across dials. "Less if you keep them off me." He grinned, grim and sharp. "We'll buy you the time." The camp was alive with chaos. Sirens still shrieked, and Dragonov's voice barked over radios demanding his men crush the revolt. But momentum had shifted. The guards, once confident, now scrambled in. Disarray, unnerved by the sight of their own helicopter under siege. Selene's hands danced across unfamiliar levers, matching her knowledge to the alien machine. Her father's words echoed. Flying was thinking in 3 dimensions, reading machines as if they were breathing creatures. The hind trembled, turbines spooling higher, rotors biting at the air. For the first time since the crash, she felt power flood back into her control. She looked at Holt, standing guard in the doorway with rifle raised. The captured prisoners forming a perimeter around their prize. "Hold them," she said, voice carrying through the roar. "I'm taking us airborne." And as the ground shook beneath the beating blades, the prison camp realized too late that what they thought was containment had just become the beginning of a storm. The Hind shuddered as Celine coaxed its unfamiliar controls, turbines screaming for altitude. Dust spiraled upward, cloaking the pad in a storm of grit and smoke. Outside, Holt and his men formed a living barricade, rifles barking at guards scrambling from the barracks. Every heartbeat stretched, a contest between the machine's rising power and the camp's collapsing discipline. With a decisive pull, Celine lifted the heavy helicopter free of the ground. The skids cleared, wobbling in protest, but her hands steadied the beast. The vibration rattled her bones, but beneath it she sensed the same living pulse as her Apache, different bones, same blood. She set her jaw. This bird belonged to her now. Below, Dragunov burst onto the yard, rage twisting his face. He shouted for anti-air weapons, gesturing wildly at the churning sky. But Celine had already banked the Hind, swinging its nose toward the heart of the compound. Through the canopy she saw the prison like a blueprint, guard towers perched like fragile teeth, antennas stabbing upward, fuel tanks exposed in the corner. Targets she had memorized without ever setting foot outside her cage. "Hold tight," she called over the intercom, though most of the rescued prisoners clung to the cabin walls in silence, eyes wide. Holt braced in the doorway, a grim smile flashing as he realized what she intended. The first burst of cannon fire tore across the nearest tower, splinters of wood and steel cascading into the yard. The guards who moments before had been chasing captives now dove for cover, panic replacing discipline. Celine swung left, loosing rockets into the communications mast. The explosion lit the dusk in a bloom of fire, cables snapping like whips, radios inside the command block going instantly mute. The camp convulsed. Searchlights fell dark, orders vanished into static, and men scattered without direction. Dragunov's furious gestures turned desperate as he tried to rally what little remained of his force. Celine felt the Hind's recoil vibrate up her arms, her whole body alive with the power of vengeance. She remembered Creed's final breath, the mocking laughter when she was shoved in chains, Dragunov's smug promise that she would bend. All of it crystallized into the clarity of this moment. She would not only escape, she would erase the prison from the earth. She dove low, skimming the fence line, firing again. The barracks erupted, flames chasing men from their hiding places. Prisoners still in the cages screamed in shock, then in joy as the walls that confined them cracked under the storm. Holt's voice cut through the roar. "We've broken them! Finish it!" Celine climbed, banking hard, then angled down. She set her sights on the fuel depot. One squeeze of the trigger, and the tanks erupted, a chain of fire racing along pipes, swallowing the far side of the compound in a rolling inferno. The ground bucked, shock waves slamming against the fuselage. She held steady, teeth clenched, eyes unblinking. Through the haze, she caught Dragunov's silhouette once more. He stood rigid amid the chaos, shouting into a dead radio, watching his empire dissolve. For the briefest instant their gazes crossed again, her from above, him from the ruins. She gave him nothing but the flat certainty of a predator. Then she pulled the Hind higher, turning toward the mountains where freedom waited. Behind her, the camp was no longer a fortress. It was a graveyard lit by its own flames. Celine exhaled, steadying the machine as Holt slammed the cabin door shut and barked at the others to secure themselves. The fight was not over. Enemy patrols would come, but the prison that was meant to swallow them had been annihilated by its own weapon, flown by the woman they thought was finished. And in the roar of rotors, Celine felt something fierce and undeniable. Not just survival, but justice carried on wings she had stolen from her captors. The hind climbed through smoke, blades thrashing the air with a fury that matched Celine's heartbeat. Below, the prison camp burned in collapsing waves, towers folding, the fuel depot a roaring inferno. She leveled the helicopter just beyond the perimeter, hands flying across controls. She had known for only minutes, yet commanded as if they had always been hers. Holt staggered into the cockpit doorway, his face streaked with soot and sweat. "You've gutted the place," he shouted over the turbines. "We're clear. Let's head for the ridge." Celine didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on the thermal display flickering in front of her, an unfamiliar panel, but one she quickly deciphered. Amid the blaze, pockets of heat glowed where no fire should have been, deep underground. Inside reinforced cells she had glimpsed only once in passing, lives still flickered. Prisoners left to rot where daylight never reached. Her grip tightened on the collective. "Not yet." Holt's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean, not yet? We've got the bird. We've got our men. If we stay, they'll scramble more assets." "There are people still inside," Celine said, her voice calm but cutting. "I saw their shadows on the display. Dragunov buried them in a sub-level. If we leave now, they die screaming under the rubble." Holt cursed, running a hand over his scalp. "That's suicide. We've pushed luck further than anyone could ask." Celine banked the hind back toward the flames, ignoring his protest. "Luck didn't get us this far. Calculation did. You wanted certainty. There it is." The helicopter swept low over the wreckage, heat distortion wavering across the canopy. Celine guided it toward a stretch of scorched earth near the collapsed command post, where flames had not yet reached. She set the skids down in a controlled skid, rotors still turning, dust and ash churning like a storm around them. "Cover me," she ordered. Before Holt could argue, she was out of the cockpit, boots hitting the dirt, pistol raised. A half-dozen prisoners followed instinctively, some armed with scavenged rifles, others with nothing but fists and fury. They pushed through the chaos toward a sunken concrete hatch, half buried by debris. Celine knelt, running her hands across the metal, then fired twice into the padlock. The steel screamed, then split. She threw her weight against the door. It groaned open, exhaling the stench of darkness and neglect. Voices rose from below, weak, desperate but alive. Prisoners clambered toward the opening, faces hollow with weeks of confinement. Celine and Holt's men dragged them into the open air one after another until nearly a dozen had surfaced. Some stumbled blindly, shielding their eyes from a light they had forgotten. Gunfire crackled from the far side of the yard. The last loyal guards had regrouped, shooting wildly in an attempt to halt the evacuation. Holt returned fire, his men shouting warnings. Celine pulled the last captive through the hatch, then hurled a grenade down the stairwell before slamming the door shut. The explosion rocked the ground, sealing the dungeon forever. "Back to the hind!" she barked. They sprinted across the ruined yard, weaving through smoke and scattered debris. Celine climbed back into the pilot's seat, guiding the new arrivals aboard while Holt's fighters leapt in behind them. The helicopter groaned under the added weight, but Celine's touch was precise, coaxing it skyward as rounds pinged off the fuselage. The hind clawed into the evening air once more, the prison shrinking into a smouldering ruin below. Inside the cabin, the newly freed men wept, some clutching each other, others staring at Celine as though they had seen a ghost. Holt watched her, his earlier skepticism dissolved into something like awe. "You saw them when no one else did," he muttered. "You risked all of us for strangers." Celine kept her eyes forward, scanning the horizon. "I wasn't leaving anyone in Dragunov's grave, not while I had the power to lift them out." The words settled in the cabin like a vow, heavy and unshakable, even in exhaustion. Every man there understood this wasn't just an escape anymore. It was a rescue forged in fire, and it had been led by the woman they had first mistaken for a broken captive. As the Hind banked toward the mountain passes, Celine finally allowed herself a single breath of satisfaction. The camp was gone, Dragunov's hold shattered, and more lives had been saved than even Holt had dared to imagine. But she knew the reprieve was thin. Enemy forces would regroup. Pursuit would come. The hard part was still ahead. For now, though, she had turned a prison into rubble and stolen back the lives it tried to bury. That was enough. The Hind surged into the mountain air, heavy with the weight of too many passengers. Every rotor beat a hammer, driving them higher from the inferno they had left behind. The prison was gone, burned out by its own arrogance. Yet Celine Kalen felt no ease in her chest. The real battle was only beginning. Enemy forces would not allow this theft to go unanswered. She held the controls with iron steadiness, trimming the pitch, coaxing lift from the strained engines. The helicopter responded grudgingly, an old warhorse pressed to carry more than its design allowed. Behind her, the rescued men clung to straps and bulkheads, some whispering prayers, others staring at her with a reverence that weighed almost as much as the machine itself. Holt sat just inside the cabin door, rifle across his knees, keeping his men steady with clipped words and steady eyes. "Northwest," he shouted above the engine roar, pointing toward the jagged ridges. "Beyond those peaks, friendlies may reach us." Celine shook her head. "Not yet. We can't fly blind. Radar will catch us if we go high, and ground patrols will cut us off if we go low without cover." She angled the Hind into a canyon, hugging the shadows that stretched across its stone walls. Dust flared beneath them, the turbines whining as she forced the lumbering aircraft through terrain it wasn't built to trust. A voice crackled in the back, one of the rescued soldiers whose face was still hollow from weeks in darkness. "They'll come after us. We should have just run." Celine didn't glance back, but her words carried to every ear in the fuselage. Running is what they expect. Fighting is what they never see coming. And then, as if summoned by her defiance, the threat appeared. From the far end of the canyon, the rhythmic chop of blades echoed. A second Hind, fully armed, slid into view, its silhouette stark against the reddening sky. Enemy pursuit had arrived, and they were not interested in taking prisoners. Holt cursed, standing to brace himself against the doorframe. "What's the plan?" Celine's eyes narrowed, the canyon walls rushing past in a blur. "The plan is, we make them regret ever teaching me their controls." The opposing helicopter opened fire first. Cannon shells gouging the rock face, shards spraying into the gorge. The prisoners screamed, ducking against the fuselage as fragments rattled across the cabin like hail. Celine dropped the collective, plunging the Hind lower, skimming barely above the canyon floor. Dust blinded the air, the walls narrowing so tight it felt like threading a needle at 100 knots. The enemy followed, hunting her through the cut in the earth. But Celine knew terrain better than any manual could teach. She read the stone curves, anticipated the bends, felt the downdrafts shift under her palms. Where her pursuers saw obstacles, she saw weapons. She barked over her shoulder, "Everyone down! Hold tight! Then she yanked the hind hard left, scraping a rock outcrop close enough that the rotor tips hissed sparks. The pursuing helicopter mimicked the turn a second too late, clipping the canyon wall. It recovered, wobbling, but not without bleeding altitude. Holt let out a sharp laugh, half disbelieving. "You're flying this crate like it was born yours." Celine didn't answer. Her focus was razor-thin, every muscle an extension of the controls. The enemy was still behind them, angry, correcting, and ready to fire again. She pulled the hind up sharply, bursting from the canyon into open sky. The prisoners gasped at the sudden flood of light, but Celine was all ready, twisting, bringing her stolen bird around to face its twin. The air trembled with the standoff. Two beasts circling, each painted with the same markings, one crude by captors, the other by the very people they thought broken. The enemy opened fire again, tracers streaking past the cockpit. Celine jerked the machine into a climb, then pitched nose down, diving straight at them. Holt grabbed the overhead strap, yelling, "Are you insane?" "Completely," Celine muttered, then pressed the trigger. The hind's cannon spat fire, shells ripping across the enemy's rotor arc. Smoke erupted from its side, the machine lurching away in panic. Celine rolled right, climbing through its slipstream, then dropped behind it, predator on prey. Her fingers tightened. Rockets whooshed from the pylons, slamming into the trailing helicopter. The sky blossomed into fire, shards tumbling earthward, trailing smoke that painted the horizon black. Silence followed, broken only by the hum of their own engines. In the cabin, men stared at her with awe and disbelief. Holt shook his head, a grin cracking his dirt-smeared face. "Viper suits you? You strike once and they never see it coming." Celine's expression was grim. "That was just the first. They'll scramble more. We need to move faster." She swung the hind toward a wide valley, the mountains behind them glowing with the fires of their destruction. The men inside murmured, some clutching each other, others gripping weapons tighter, braced for the storm yet to come. As they skimmed low across the valley floor, Celine caught sight of something below. Concrete bunkers hidden under camouflage netting, half concealed in the brush. More enemy positions, too close to the path Holt had first suggested. She veered away sharply, trusting instinct and memory, charting a new course through terrain scarred by years of conflict. The night crept toward them, shadows lengthening, and still she flew. Her eyes burned, her muscles screamed, but the fire inside her did not dim. She had taken their machine, used it against them, and shattered their pride. Now she carried not just her life, but the weight of every man packed into the fuselage. Holt leaned into the cockpit again, voice lower this time. "Whatever happens, they'll tell this story for 100 years." Celine didn't look away from the horizon. "Then let's make sure it ends the right way." The hind pressed on into the darkening sky, a stolen thunderbolt carrying warriors who refused to die toward a destiny neither side could have imagined. The valley spread below them like a wound in the earth, blackened ridges cutting sharp against a copper horizon. Celine Kalen held the hind steady, the weight of every rescued soul pressing on her shoulders. The battle in the canyon still throbbed in her blood, the rival gunship spiraling into fire, the sickening shudder of the earth when it struck. For a moment, silence had stretched, their survival balanced on the edge of disbelief. Now there was only forward motion, the helicopter chewing distance with heavy, relentless rhythm. Holt climbed into the cockpit again, crouching against the vibration. His face was streaked, not with fear, but with the strain of leadership. "We can't just keep running valleys," he said, voice pitched low so the others wouldn't hear. "They'll regroup. When the sun rises, every outpost in these mountains will be hunting us." Celine adjusted the trim, eyes on the ridgeline, which is why we don't wait for them to corner us. We break their teeth before they close the jaws. He frowned, confused, until he saw where she was looking. To the east, through a gap in the hills, flickered faint lights. Not fires, but controlled glows, steady and deliberate. A facility dug into the slope, supply hub, fuel storage, comms tower. The same type of infrastructure she had studied in her years of combat flights. Every enemy chain had its weak link. "You're not thinking," Holt began. "I am," Celine cut in. "If we leave it standing, Dragunov's people recover. If we cut it down, they choke." The sergeant swore under his breath, but he didn't argue further. He knew the logic. Retreat meant being hunted. Attack meant controlling the tempo. Celine dipped the hind lower, hugging terrain as she closed in. The helicopter groaned with the strain of weight and stress. But her hands soothed it, guiding the machine like a beast tamed by conviction. Inside the cabin, the men held their silence, though a ripple of anticipation ran through them. They had seen her turn fear into fire once already. They would follow wherever she pointed the nose. The compound came into view, bunkers clustered around fuel tanks, antennae stabbing the sky, trucks parked in neat rows. Guards milled casually at the perimeter, unaware of the storm about to descend. Celine's pulse slowed, her breath deliberate. She toggled the weapon systems, unfamiliar script flashing across the panels, but instinct told her what each switch concealed. Holt leaned against the doorway, teeth bared in a wolf's grin. "Hit them hard," he urged. The hind roared in, a shadow screaming out of dusk. Celine loosed the first salvo, a spray of rockets streaking toward the storage tanks. The valley lit in a single breath, fire ripping upward, shock waves hammering. The aircraft as though the earth itself had been torn open. Men below scattered, stumbling in panic, their neat lines unraveling into chaos. Celine pulled wide, banking back. "Second run!" she barked. Holt's men braced, some shouting in exultation, others gripping the fuselage like sailors riding a storm. This time she aimed for the tower. The cannon spat, shells shredding steel and concrete, the comms mast collapsing like a toppled spear. Radios that had been screeching orders moments earlier dissolved into static. Enemy units across the region, blind and panicked, shouted into void channels that would never answer again. The survivors tried to mount a defense. Small arms rattled uselessly against the armored hull. A truck-mounted gun swung upward, tracers reaching clumsily for the sky. Celine slid the hind sideways, angling low, and carved a line of fire. That ripped the weapon apart, scattering men in its wreckage. She felt Holt's hand clap her shoulder. "That's it! Tear it down!" But even as triumph burned in their eyes, Celine's mind stayed sharp. Not finished. Scan the ground. Look for tunnels, stores, anything they'll use to rebuild. And then she saw it. A camouflaged hatch at the far edge of the compound, half hidden beneath netting and brush. Her gut tightened. She recognized the pattern. An underground cache, possibly even another cell for high-value captives. Dragunov's methods repeated like bad scripture. She swung the hind over, pointing it out to Holt. He stared, disbelief in his eyes. "You're not. Celine, we've already pulled more than anyone dreamed. We can't risk a landing." But she was already descending. "We don't leave shadows alive beneath the dirt. Not this time." The helicopter settled hard, dust exploding around it. Celine kept the rotors hot, ready to lift in an instant. Holt and two men leapt out, rushing the hatch. Explosives tore it open, smoke coughing upward. Shouts followed, voices desperate, pleading. Prisoners again, hidden away as bargaining chips. One by one, gaunt figures stumbled into the light. Celine's men pulled them aboard, dragging them into the already cramped cabin. The Hind groaned under the added load, but Celine refused to leave them. Every life dragged up from the underground was another strike against Dragunov's arrogance. Then the retaliation came. Mortar rounds whistled from the hillside, enemy reinforcements scrambling into place. The first shell landed close, rocking the helicopter. Celine snarled and yanked Collective, shouting for Holt's team to get aboard. They piled in, hauling the last survivor with them as another round landed, showering the fuselage with dirt and shrapnel. "Hold on!" Celine roared. The Hind surged upward, lumbering but determined. As blasts tore the compound into deeper ruin below, Holt slammed the cabin door, gasping with adrenaline. "You're mad!" he shouted through the noise, "but you just saved every soul they tried to bury." Celine's jaw clenched. "I'm not mad. I'm finished letting them keep people in cages." The helicopter clawed altitude, the valley fire shrinking beneath them. Behind, the supply hub was gone, its reserves turned to ash, its communications severed, its prisoners freed. Ahead lay more mountains, more dangers, but also the chance of deliverance. Inside the cabin, the rescued men clung to one another, some sobbing openly, others whispering Celine's name like it was already legend. Holt watched her at the controls. His earlier doubts burned away, replaced by respect so deep it bordered on reverence. For Celine, there was no time to savor it. She scanned the horizon, watching for the next threat. She knew Dragunov still lived somewhere in the chaos, furious, humiliated, plotting revenge. She meant to make sure he would never cage another pilot again. The Hind pressed into the gathering dark, a stolen beast carrying the storm farther into enemy territory. What had begun as survival had become something larger, retribution, liberation, and a message. Carved into flame, no prison, no commander, no regime could hold forever what was born to fly. And as Celine gripped the unfamiliar controls with hands steady as iron, she whispered into the wind, "You should never have thought I was just a prisoner." The mountains swallowed the horizon, jagged silhouettes against a sky painted in copper and violet. Inside the stolen Hind, the air was thick with oil, sweat, and the raw stench of fear finally loosening into hope. Celine Kalin kept her grip steady on the cyclic, her eyes fixed forward, every instinct alive to the possibility of pursuit. The weight of rescued men pressed the helicopter past its limit, but she coaxed it like a horse already half broken, urging it to carry them one more mile, then another. Behind her, the cabin was a cramped gallery of faces, gaunt cheeks, bruised eyes, hands gripping straps or each other as though letting go would return them to chains. Some muttered prayers, others stared silently, their expressions carved by shock and awe. Holt crouched near the door, rifle across his lap, his presence the spine of discipline amid exhaustion. When he caught her glance, he nodded once, a pact sealed without words. They had gone too far to falter now. The radio sputtered with static. Celine leaned toward it, twisting dials, catching fragments in the enemy tongue. Reports screamed of a prison annihilated, supply depots burning, aircraft stolen. Panic wove through the transmissions, commanders demanding explanations, soldiers refusing to answer. For the first time she heard fear, not from prisoners, but from their captors. Still, danger crouched at every ridge. Dragunov would not stop. His pride would not allow a single woman to humiliate his empire without retribution. Celine knew he would unleash every weapon at his disposal to hunt them before they reached the frontier. She pressed the Hind low, weaving along the contours of the valley floor, rotors slicing the air just meters above treetops. The machine shuddered under strain, but she rode its resistance like a tide. Her father's lessons echoed. Think in 3 dimensions, turn obstacles into cover. In the twisting terrain she found shield after shield, hiding their lumbering shadow from radar and eyes alike. Night thickened, swallowing the last orange threads of sun. In the dark, every glint became threat, every echo of engines a possible hunter. Holt crept into the cockpit again, voice low. We can't stay in the open. They'll vector fast movers before long. Celine's eyes never left the horizon. We won't be in the open. We'll vanish under their noses. He frowned, unsure if it was bravado or calculation. She banked left, guiding the Hind into a gorge where fog pooled like smoke from a hidden fire. The mist wrapped around them, dense and cold, muting the throb of engines. For a moment, the prisoners in the cabin thought she had lost her way, until she traced a line of glowing markers faintly visible beneath the fog. River bends she had memorized from charts long ago, terrain etched into memory during endless hours of training. The Hind ghosted through the gorge, the mist cloaking their passage. Celine's heart slowed into the rhythm of the machine. She let her hands trust instinct, each correction small but precise. When they emerged on the far side, the valley opened into silence. No tracers, no searchlights, only stars sprawling across black sky. But safety was illusion. Within minutes, the radio crackled again. Enemy patrols closing, ground. Convoys repositioning. Aircraft scrambled from distant bases. She listened, parsing accents and codes. They weren't simply searching, they were converging. Dragunov had loosed the net. Holt cursed when she relayed it. We can't outrun them all. No, Celine said, adjusting course. So we don't. We choose where to meet them. Ahead, a plateau rose from the valley floor, a flat expanse she recognized from reconnaissance months before. Abandoned bunkers dotted its edge, relics of a forgotten conflict. But to Celine, it was opportunity. High ground, open sky, the perfect stage for one last strike. She skimmed the Hind across the ridge, then hovered just long enough for Holt to grasp her plan. His eyes widened. You mean to fight them here? Celine's voice was steady. Better here than over the border with no cover. We break them now, or we'll never reach our own lines. The sergeant studied her face, then barked orders into the cabin. Men scrambled, positioning themselves at the open doors. Scavenged rifles braced, grenades checked. They were exhausted, but her certainty infused them with iron. For the first time since capture, they weren't just fugitives. They were combatants again. The first wave came as predicted. Enemy helicopters, smaller scouts sweeping low. Celine throttled forward, bringing the Hind into a shallow climb. Cannon fire roared, cutting down the scouts before they understood the stolen bird was hunting them. One spiraled into the trees, the other veered off, trailing smoke. The cabin erupted in shouts of triumph, but Celine silenced them with a curt gesture. More would come. Moments later, they did. 2 heavy transports lumbered into view, doors open, soldiers bristling. Celine rolled the Hind sideways, lining her cannons, and fired. The night tore open with tracers, one transport exploding midair, the other banking wildly. Holt's men hurled captured grenades into the void, their defiance shaking the stars themselves. Still, the enemy pressed. From the east, headlights marked convoys climbing the ridge, anti-air teams setting up launchers. Celine gritted her teeth, pitching the Hind into a dive. She strafed the trucks with ruthless precision, fuel lines erupting into fireballs, men scattering into the dark. The ridge lit like day, a funeral pyre for Dragunov's reinforcements. In the chaos, Holt fought at the cabin door, firing into the darkness, voice raw from shouting encouragement. Prisoners who had been skeletal shadows days earlier now roared like warriors reborn. Celine caught glimpses of their faces in the strobe of gunfire, eyes burning, jaws clenched, every man choosing to live as fighters rather than ghosts. Then came the voice she expected. Through the static, harsh and unmistakable, Dragunov himself barked over an open frequency. His words were fury incarnate, demanding she surrender, promising she would be broken if she resisted further. Celine pressed the transmit button, her tone calm as stone. "Commander Dragunov, this is Captain Celine Kalin, United States Army. You said I was just another pilot. Tonight you learn the cost of underestimation." The channel went dead. She knew he had heard. She wanted him to. The final push came at midnight. 2 fighters streaked overhead, engines screaming. Celine swerved, hugging the contours of the plateau, forcing the jets to overshoot. Their missiles slashed the ground, explosions clawing the rock, but she kept the hind weaving, never giving them a clean lock. Holt braced himself in the cabin, yelling over the din, "We can't take another pass!" Celine's eyes narrowed. "Then we make sure there isn't one." She skimmed low, baiting the jets into another dive. At the last instant, she pulled hard skyward, the hind groaning but obeying. The fighters overshot again, one too low, clipping the ridge. Fire consumed it in an instant. The second broke off, unwilling to chase further into her trap. Silence returned, heavy and unreal. The battlefield was a smear of burning vehicles, shattered aircraft, the echoes of men shouting and dying. The hind hovered above it all, battered but alive. Inside, Holt's men slumped in exhaustion, their weapons falling to their sides. The newly freed prisoners clung to each other, disbelief and relief mingling in their eyes. Celine leveled the helicopter, turning it westward. Over the radio she switched frequencies, trying a band she had memorized from countless missions. Static hissed, then a clear voice answered. "American, cautious, clipped. Unidentified aircraft. State your call sign." Celine swallowed, voice steady despite the burn in her throat.
"This is Captain Celine Kalin, U.S. Army.
"I'm flying a captured hind with 17 rescued personnel aboard. Request immediate clearance and escort to friendly base." A pause, disbelief crackling in the silence. Then, "Confirm, you're flying enemy hardware." Celine allowed the faintest smile. "Confirmed. Their mistake, our salvation." In the cabin, Holt laughed. A rough, unpolished sound that carried like victory itself. The radio clicked again, the controller's voice hushed with awe. "Captain, vectors inbound. Welcome home." The hind pressed forward into the dark, carrying freedom on blades stolen from the enemy. Celine exhaled, not relief but resolve. She had broken Dragunov's empire in one night, turned a cage into a battlefield and carved legend out of fire and steel. They thought she was just a prisoner. Now she was the storm that ended them. The rotors slowed, the whine fading into silence as boots touched friendly soil. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, the air did not carry the taste of smoke or fear. It carried the sound of men breathing freely, of chains broken, of voices rising in disbelief that freedom was real. Celine stepped down from the battered hind last. Her legs trembled, not from weakness but from the sheer release of everything she had carried in her chest. Around her, soldiers rushed to embrace those who had been lost, medics weaving through the crowd, tears spilling freely. Holt clasped her shoulder, no words spoken because none were needed. Respect lived in silence stronger than any medal. But as the camp celebrated, Celine's eyes drifted east, back to the ridges burning against the horizon. She knew Dragunov still lived. She knew men like him would rise again, cloaking cruelty in uniforms and flags. Tonight was a victory, but it was not the end. Still, in that moment, she had proven a truth no enemy could erase. One person's defiance could tear holes in an empire. One pilot with nothing left but skill, courage, and fury had turned prisoners into warriors, despair into triumph, and silence into a roar that would echo through generations. History will remember Celine Kalin as more than a pilot, more than a prisoner. She became the embodiment of resilience, the storm that refused to be broken. Her fight was not for medals, not for glory, but for the simple belief that no man has the right to cage another. And perhaps that is why her story lingers, not because of the explosions or the fire in the sky, but because every viewer who hears it feels a question burning inside. What chains would I break if it were me? Would I have the courage to rise when everyone else bowed their head? Celine's answer was carved in smoke and blood. Yes, she rose. And in doing so, she reminded us all that freedom is not given. It is taken, defended, fought for in the darkest hours. So if this story moved you, if the fire of her defiance lit even a spark inside your chest, let it grow. Tell her story, share it, keep it alive, because legends only remain if we carry them forward. This is Veteran Biker, where we tell the stories others bury, where silent defenders rise in the shadows, and we make sure their names are never forgotten. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what freedom means to you, or simply salute Celine Kalin with your words. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, hit like, subscribe, and join our community, because tomorrow there will be another name, another battle, another silent defender standing alone against the impossible. And when their story reaches us, we will be here again, together, to witness, to remember, to honor. Until then, ride with us, carry the fire, and never forget, they thought she was just a prisoner, but she became the storm.